All right, hey, welcome to our topic here on these 6 economic lessons. Now, when we're talking about markets, such as this example, corn market here, we can see that prices go up and prices go down. We might want to say that we understand why the prices went up and why the prices went down. But if that were really true, we would not have risk. And unfortunately, we have risk. When corn increases or corn decreases, either one, those create risk situations in the market. And as an agribusiness, we would like to better manage these risks. And the first thing to do is to probably try to understand them. Now, not only is there risk in this market example, but there's also potential profit that we could make. So understanding this market would be very essential if you were involved in an agribusiness that was directly connected to this market. These topics of these 6 economic lessons are not only important, hopefully, to better understand a corn market and what it might do or move and better understand the direction of the market, but they may just be great lessons for life to understand how our markets work and how people value or identify worth, what a policy does to an outcome, and what are the long-term effects, because that's what we really ought to be focusing on, not the short-term situation. So these 6 economic lessons are just content that might help frame the understanding of news and what comes out in policy and what's going on, and applying these lessons to this corn market, for example, or any economic market, might help us better estimate or understand what the outcomes would be. Our expectations might be in check, and therefore we might make better business decisions. So let's move this corn market out of the way, and let's focus on these 6 economic lessons. Now, I'm going to write on the board. You do the same. Write notes. Things I write on the board are definitely important, but the things that I talk about that I don't write on the board are the notes that you need to take. Be an active learner, and you'll get more out of this setup. All right, let's start talking about the first one. Toys, not dollars. Now, I'm not talking about your matchbook cars here, but what I'm talking about is that items, in fact, if I write this out, maybe this helps, items are really worth more than the money it takes to buy them when you're trying to understand an economy or when you're trying to understand a market. So the idea here with toys, not dollars, is that you can measure a measure, I should say, of an economy might be not the money or the balance that you have, but how many items you have accrued. Now, I don't know if I necessarily take to this personally. I don't think your personal growth is measured completely by the toys that you have. In fact, if you measure someone's toys personally that they have, you might not also understand the debt that goes along with that. So there's kind of like a thing to wrap your mind around here. Don't take it anywhere out of context. But in an economy, we tend to think about money as the measure of value, but really it might be the items, or the items and what they do might be really where the value lies. So, in other words, when you're looking at an economy, an example of it's not about the dollars, it's about the toys, could be an example of balance of trade. Now, that's a big topic today that we have with balance of trade, and that has to do with this simply that you in a economy have exports, and we would all agree that exports are good because as we produce products that we can't consume, some other country wants those, and that's an export. Well, we would hope that we would have more of that than imports, and for a long time our policies focused on that. However, with the balance of trade, when you have more imports than exports, from a dollar standpoint, that is not a good thing, but a bad thing. The reason is because we are producing products to sell those, and the importer is to buy those from us, and we hope they do more of that than we buy from them. But if you flip this around, China is sending more products to the U.S. than we are sending to them, so we're sending more money their way, they're sending less money our way, and that is looked at sometimes as a bad economy. However, that gets challenged when you say, what about the toys? Because the number of items, the number of toys that we have, if that's greater than some other economic entity, their toys, if our U.S. toys are bigger than their other country toys, then that is actually identified as a good thing, a positive thing for an economy. So this idea of toys, not dollars, kind of tries to just say that balance of trade is a good example of where we may have a negative balance of trade, but that could be okay based on this. Do we have more benefits of items that our consumers are able to get, possibly at a cheaper price? So it's a current debate right now in our economy, and it is something that continues to never stop. It will be a constant review. And so the balance of trade is another example. Also, when we think about consumer demand, toys could be related to value, or I might even say features, like the things that are in our trucks right now today. So these truck features that we have are really an indication of our economy. As we grow as an economy, if we demand more toys from our consumption level, then that's a good indication of an increased growth in our economy. For a long, long time, trucks are an example product that we can all relate to, or cars of any kind. Tesla is a good example as well. Automotive features have skyrocketed, and so has the value of the vehicles. So when we get to talking about dollars, is it about that it cost more to make a Tesla, or it cost more to make a King Ranch Edition Ford 4-door, 1-ton, 4-wheel drive truck? It cost more to make those vehicles? Well, it probably does cost more, but is it about the money, or is it about the value, the toys that are added into these vehicles? For example, with the Tesla vehicles, increased auto safety. I don't understand that one. It has a giant big iPad for a screen there that you can mess with. But auto driving features, which also baffle me as well. But these are toys that we demand as consumers, or we think about that we think it's worth something, and then the producer makes it, and then we say, yeah, I want that, and I'll pay you extra for that. So it is not about what it costs. The King Ranch Edition truck, of course, the King Ranch is a famous place, and so is it about the King Ranch name? Some folks aren't even sure what that is that buy those vehicles, but they like the leather seats. They like the added features that exist in that. They like the color schemes. They like the way the truck looks. All of those things are not really about money. They're about toys. So when you're trying to understand a market, try to also think about what benefits people are getting and where do they see value. And it might land you to show growth or potential growth while everyone is talking about the downside of the negatives, and they could be wrong. And if you're right, you can understand risk. So it's about toys and not dollars. All right, what's the next one that I want to talk about here? And it is about unintended consequences. Sometimes we have a planned outcome. So this has a lot to do with policy. There is a planned outcome, but the result is not the same. So we don't end up getting what our planned outcome was. Why is that? Because the law of unintended consequences. There's lots of examples of this, and so I want to make sure I cover a few. So one of those is the Exxon Valdez. A lot of people understand the Exxon company, and really it depends on your history, but Exxon Valdez was an oil tanker out of Alaska that ran aground or had some problem. I don't remember even what it was, but it spilled just oil all into the ecosystem. That actually caused a huge negative impact on the environment. Lots of lawsuits got thrown out there, and at that time, companies were kind of protected through legal action of our government that they could not be sued for things over and over. They could not be sued this past amounts. And really, they came through with legislation that just threw that all away. Companies were wide open to be sued. So that was an intention. That was the focus. We need to make Exxon, or companies like Exxon, to be liable for these huge losses they may have. Well, the unintended part was Exxon said, all right, we own the oil tanker. It was our tanker. We were transporting that oil. That was more efficient for us. That's why we decided to do it. But it is a risk. and that risk is no longer worth it. So what did Exxon do? They now outsource that to third-party companies that are going to do all the transportation. And they are going to just throw their hands up and say, that's actually not our risk anymore, it's someone else's. Well, these companies could be small. They could be very easily shut down and just file bankruptcy and go away. Large company like Exxon would have a hard time getting that done unless there was a lot of reasons to do it. So they took the risk, offloaded it to someone else that might not actually take care of that as well. So unintended consequences. Another unintended consequence example would be auto safety. Now, there's a lot of debate here with auto safety, but in the early 60s, cars got bigger engines, were faster, but they had no power brakes. In other words, when you pushed on the brake, you had to actually physically push it hard enough to drive the pressure to the cylinders to slow it down. Manual brakes are difficult, but power brakes actually help. Power steering makes it easier to turn. Better seat belts, better airbags, all of these features, better handling, front ends on the cars, they've all improved. And what has it done? It's probably made drivers drive faster and probably drive a lot more reckless than they would have before. Now, there's a lot of information out there about how safety is improved and people are a lot less likely to die in a car crash than before, but the number of incidences are way up, and it has a lot to do with auto safety, kind of unintended consequences. Back to our corn market, there may be something that someone does that hopefully creates like another industry subsidized, like ethanol. What does that do for the corn market? Well, it's a great thing for the corn market. It's a new product it can go to. But does that have consequences in the feed industry and the other industries? And it does. So a good example of unintended consequences may be the examples of ethanol in our fuel industry and how that's impacted other industries. There's a ton of examples of these ideas called unintended consequences, but you need to always think about in a market how these things might affect other industries. So that's an economic lesson to consider. All right, this next one, markets work really well. Well, they really do. Markets work well. What is a market? Well, a market's made up of demand, which is a consumer, and it's made up of supply, which is the producer. So the idea is you've got demand and supply, and they create something called a market. And so if I come down here, I've got price and I've got quantity, and consumers would pay a super high price, but their demand actually would encourage them to buy more if it would be less money. So that is what demand looks like. Consumers might pay a whole lot, but they won't buy very much. But if consumers could pay very little, they'd buy a ton. Now, it depends on, of course, the product and how this demand curve slope, but that's the general idea of demand. Well, what about supply? Well, supply is the opposite. They are the producers. They are willing to produce at a very low price, but they're not going to produce very much. Now, if they can sell it for a high price, they're willing to produce a ton. Once again, it depends on the cost structure of producers. But that's the idea of a market. So what is this all about? Why do we say markets work well? Well, because if you let the market do it on its own, that's the quantity that producers and the consumers will all want. That's the price they all agree to, and then this all works well. In fact, you even have this area here that consumers did not have to pay these high prices. So this whole area is called consumer surplus because they did not have to pay those high prices. So they're really tickled about that. Now, what about producers? Well, they're kind of tickled too because they didn't have to take these low prices. So we call that producer surplus. And that actually is a whole area that producers just did not have to deal with. And so markets work well. Now, when you do anything in a market to alter the supply or to alter the demand, either one of those. If things come out from a policy perspective that alter how much someone is able to buy, or they make it a limitation where they cannot buy certain things, or they subsidize consumers that want to buy those things, or they halt production of a certain product, or they make it more difficult and make it more costly, you're going to alter supply or you're going to alter demand. When you change these, you affect producers and consumers. And these markets, will get into the details of who affects what and how they're affected. But just understanding that a market is made up of demand and supply, and if you leave it alone, it will clear and it will work really well. If you alter it, you end up with surpluses, shortages, higher prices, low prices, and you end up with things that we see in the market all of the time. Now, not that markets stick like this. They move up and down because by themselves, supply and demand change. So there's not even just intervention from the government that alters these, but it just could be the industry itself. The ideas, for example, of grass-fed beef. If you go back 15 or 20 years, that was kind of a goofy thing, but grass-fed beef is a great example of something today that actually has a real supply and demand market. And in the very beginning, you had a supply and demand equilibrium that was very different than today. But now we have enough production, now we have a supply chain, now we have consumer knowledge about that and understanding, and it's actually more of a legit product. So supply and demand work well. They do change. They're never fixed. They're always moving. Sometimes we interject policy into this and we even mess with it even more. Leave it alone. Markets work well. That's the concept. All right, our branded beef discussion carries us into our next law, is that it's not about really price. It's more about value. So let's look at price. Sometimes when people talk about what a product is worth, price is the term. And price, spell it right here. Price is the concept that a product has a cost. And if you add to it a percentage increase, in other words, to try to make a profit, then you end up with what we call the price of a product. So for example, if it cost me $2.50 to get a pound of ground beef, grown, processed, and put into the retail grocery store to buy, then let's say an acceptable markup is, let's say it's 50 cents a pound. That means that that's a $3 price. But that's really not the view of today. The view of today that it's not about price. It's more about value. And so you have to hunt for where the value is. So today the value is very much driven by consumer demand. When we look at what consumers demand, they want certain aspects of our products. And so value really can be looked at as, what is the benefit to me? And so a good example of a benefit would be things like organic foods. Things like, a good example would be grass-fed beef. And so these are products that at one time weren't really cost effective. Like you couldn't really produce these products. But from a cost standpoint, maybe that's true because the price would be astronomical. I can't produce that much of it, therefore I have to add a huge increase, and it's going to be very expensive to make this production. But really, when we do a little work in our supply chain and we learn how to improve the way we produce products and we learn to have different channels of our supply, maybe there is a grass-fed division of large companies that actually have that now, where they have a supply chain of grass-fed product to meet that consumer need. Then they have another supply chain of more traditional production to meet that need. Maybe they have another specialty production that's a unique breed or the way the cattle have been fed and processed, and that has a value chain. So today, markets work well, but they also work today off a value perspective, which is really connected to benefit. And so hopefully that's something that you can use as we talk about the products that we consume. It is today more about value than the cost. All right, but let's go ahead and talk about cost, because it is one that we should work on, and that is this concept of what we call opportunity cost. In cost, you've really got two types. You've got what we call an accounting cost. Now, accounting cost is actually true actual cost. So you have an expense, right? And that expense is what the cost is. But there's an alternative, and that's what opportunity cost is about. The alternative is, what opportunity have you let go? Or what opportunity exists out there for the products that we're talking about? Can they be used in other ways? And they're being sold in one way, but can they be used in other ways? Good example might be dairies in production of milk, and they end up with this huge waste product of manure. But that manure not is really a cost anymore. Maybe there's an opportunity to transfer that into energy or fertilizer or other uses. And so finding the opportunity cost that exists is looking for that opportunity value, and that might be more important than the true accounting cost that we have, especially as we're looking forward. So economic lessons of opportunity cost to learn is the product that is produced might have a value and a cost, and you weigh that, and that's called an accounting cost, or even accounting profit. If you take what it's worth minus the expenses to raise it, that's opportunity cost or accounting profit. Accounting profit. Opportunity cost would be taking that and setting it aside and say, what is the alternative that we could use this? An example of opportunity cost that I like to always talk about is actually your college cost itself. Like, what does it really cost you to go to college? Some of you are going to say, well, it's going to cost me my tuition and my books and my meal plan and my dorm or my apartment, and that's what it's going to cost me. And that is true. That's your accounting cost. But what is your opportunity cost? You could leave college, not go to college at all, and actually just go straight to work, or start your own business, or go be an apprentice for someone and learn about that business. Then take that knowledge and transfer it to have your own business and grow your wealth from there. You might be better off at that. So you've got to think of, I've got an accounting cost of going to college. I better do a good job in college, because if I didn't do a good job, then really I've messed up, because I could have gone to work and started earning money 3, 4, 5 years before I actually graduated, got my first job. I could be better off. So opportunity cost is really where the market's always saying, what else could we do here? And as an investor, as an agribusiness manager, that's a lesson that we should apply. All right, the last one is time value of money, or really I say time and money, but it is about time value of money. And when we're looking at a market, we need to make sure that we realize that there is a factor of time. So if you see news in the market and it is a long-term news about time, in other words, this policy is going to come into effect and it's going to take this long for it to come into effect. The longer that it takes to come into effect, really, the less value we have today. And so time and value are inversely related. If I'm looking at a business investment that is coming out in the news that all investors are going to have to make, there might be an initial short-term move in the market because of that. But if it's a long-term investment value, then really it may be something that's less valuable to me today. So time value of money relates to the time. Now the other is the value, and value is really talked about in money as a rate. And so as rates go up, in other words, the cost of money goes up, that actually hurts the value of today, because that is something that's going to cost us money in that. So you might have changes in the markets that don't really have anything to do with the commodity itself, but it might have to do something with time or the opportunity cost or the rate that money is exchanged. All right, so hopefully these 6 economic lessons make sense to you, and they are all tools or things to think about as we try to understand the market moves that we look at in our ag business sector. Thanks.